Hello everyone, this is John, and today I'm going to begin with part 2 of the 3-part series where I'll be providing a case for why we need to improve the graphical literacy skills of pre-service teachers. In this part, I'll be diving a bit deeper into the literature and we'll be pulling out some example studies that are testing the interpretation and creative abilities of pre-service teachers when it comes to graphs and graphical representations. As I mentioned in the first part, the literature is pretty much saying that pre-service teachers do not necessarily have the education and experience needed in order to properly interpret and create graphs, and in many cases have great difficulty interpreting graphs beyond an elementary level. So to begin this presentation, I'll be showing two different types of literature based on the definition of graphical literacy. The definition of graphical literacy skills in particular is suggesting the ability to interpret and to create graphs and graphical representations. And that is pretty much how these studies have been developed. I'll show some studies dealing with the interpretation, dealing with graphs and graphical representations, and then I'll show some studies dealing with the creation and the creative abilities when it comes to designing graphs and graphical representations. So in the early 2000s, Shaw and colleagues conducted a variety of studies looking at the interpretive abilities of pre-service teachers when presented with graphs. They asked the pre-service teachers to interpret the provided graphs, and what they realized is that many teachers were drawing very large generalizations of the displayed data sets while ignoring many data points and nuances that were inconsistent with their generalizations. So the idea here is they're painting a very broad stroke of the graph and what the graph is suggesting, but they're missing a lot of those key anecdotes and key details that could be explaining other things within the graph as well. According to Roth and Bowen, the problem here is that pre-service teachers are just not actively engaging with the graphs and are not utilizing the graphs as the tools that they were meant to be used as. And to continue with Shaw and colleagues, they demonstrated that pre-service teachers who have a particularly low graphical literacy skill are more likely to rely on their previous knowledge rather than trying to depict the information that is being presented in a graph. So depending on the subject matter of the graph, when they're asked to interpret it, they're more likely to rely on their previous knowledge and assumptions of that topic before even trying to fully engage with the graph, which was demonstrated in the previous slide. So for example, Shaw and colleagues conducted a study where they provided a graph dealing with drinking and driving. And many pre-service teachers, when they were asked to interpret this graph, made the assumption that increased levels of drunk driving would lead to greater number of car accidents. What was tailored and what was the trick of this study was that Shaw and colleagues showed the opposite relationship in the graph. And according to their study, they purposely designed a graph where drunk driving and number of car accidents were not related, just to see if pre-service teachers were properly engaging with the graph or were, on the other hand, relying on their previous knowledge and previous assumptions in order to make sense of what was being displayed within the graph. So what we can see in some of these studies here is that a lack of graphical literacy skills amongst pre-service teachers is suggesting that, number one, pre-service teachers are going to draw very large generalizations from the data being presented, and in some cases, especially with low graphical literacy skills, are going to completely misrepresent the data altogether. So those first two slides were looking at the interpretation process regarding graphical literacy, and now this study by Bowen and Roth is now looking at the creative elements to graphical representations. So unfortunately, what we saw in the previous studies that interpretation wasn't so keen for pre-service teachers. And in this study, we're pretty much seeing the same thing. When it comes to the ability to create graphs, we're finding a very similar pattern as before. So in a study conducted by Bowen and Roth, pre-service teachers were asked to conduct their own scientific investigation. And in their final report, they were instructed to provide some graphs as well. So the scientific investigation here is just the idea is that they were asked to create their own experiment, collect data on it, and then write up a conclusion and the results of their data. And what happened was, based on the results and based on the final reports that were submitted by the 12 pre-service teachers, it turns out that only 10 out of the 12 actually included graphs when it was explicitly stated to do so. And out of those 10 out of the 12 that actually provided graphs, only 4 out of the 12 actually used appropriate graphs that were clearly labeled so the reader could identify the variables and the relationships within the graphs. So according to Bowen and Roth, we have 10 out of 12 that created graphs, 4 out of 12 used them properly, but the remaining 6 out of the 12 did not use graphs appropriately whatsoever. So for example, they ended up providing graphs that were either not appropriate for the trends that they were trying to depict, such as a line graph when they should have used a bar graph, or a bar graph when they should have used a scatter plot. And Bowen and Roth concluded that despite considerable preparation when helping prepare these pre-service teachers for their own independent study, and despite the fact that many of them have a Bachelor of Science degree, pre-service teachers have great difficulty with graph creation tasks and do not necessarily know when to use one type of graph over another and why. So in conclusion, for part 2, the whole premise in this presentation, or this second part, was to show when we look at graphical literacy from an interpretation standpoint and from a creation standpoint, we see that pre-service teachers are struggling in both avenues. In the next part, we'll demonstrate that not all pre-service teachers have these struggles. As in some of the studies we have already seen, some pre-service teachers do know the difference when it comes to graphical literacy and when to use one graph over another, and that's what we'll be showing the next part, is that those students that know the differences, how do they know those differences, and how can we learn from these students who already have a scientific and graphical mind. Thank you for watching this presentation.